Hey guys, it's Courtney and welcome back to my Christmas card series. Today I'm going to be using the classic flannel background stamp as well as the Caroling Squad stamp set for just the sentiments for a few different very simple cards. I have a few panels here that I'm just squirting out some Tombow Mono multi glue on the back of them and kind of smearing them around with my finger. Once this glue is dry, it becomes repositionable, so it will make my stamping a lot easier. I could just pop them in my MISTI and just keep going one after another. So once they are dry, I'm going to go ahead and align my first panel up onto my MISTI here. And I'm just paying attention to the grid lines on the bottom of my MISTI so that I can make sure that I at least somewhat have each panel lined up the same. Going to go ahead and line up my background stamp here, and I'm going to keep this right in my MISTI as well this entire time, so each one of them is pretty much stamped the same. Now, I am not doing anything special with any of these. I'm just simply stamping. So for the first one, I have a piece of Stark White cardstock. This is also by Simon Hurley Create, and I am stamping with Later Gator ink, also by Simon Hurley. Now, I did have to stamp each time, or each panel, I did have to stamp them twice, just because there's a lot of solid portions on this background stamp, so it's best to use a stamp positioner if you have one for a stamp like this. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out again, and it will kind of even out the ink as on the paper will kind of even out as it sits. And you will just want to make sure that you're cleaning your stamp as well as the bottom of your MISTI each and every time before switching to a different card panel and switching to a different color. Next, I'm going to use another piece of the Stark White cardstock, and this time I'm going to be bringing out Bee Sting ink. I love the names of his inks. If you haven't looked at them, go take a look at just the names of the inks. They're so cute. But this is obviously a darker red. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out twice again on my panel, making sure that I clean off my stamp as well as my MISTI before moving on to the next panel. And for the next one, I'm going to be bringing out a piece of Neenah Desert Storm, or you can use craft cardstock, whatever you have in your stash. And I'm going to be using Black Hybrid ink by scrapbook.com. And this is a great ink. It gives a really, really good impression, really deep black. But because I'm stamping on craft cardstock or something like craft cardstock, you might not get the best impression the first time around. So again, I did end up stamping this twice. Now, I'm going to use the same ink for another panel here, and this is a red cardstock, naturally, as you can see. And this is just from my stash. I don't have a whole lot of colored cardstock, so I just kind of pulled one. I don't keep track of what brand it is or what the actual technical color is. But I went ahead and stamped this out a couple of times as well on the red cardstock. And then finally, I'm going to go back to that Bee Sting red ink. I really liked the color of that red ink, and this time I am going to stamp this out onto another piece of the Neenah Desert Storm. So here's a quick look at all of the panels that we have. Now we're going to put these into very simple cards that we can reproduce and we can mass produce during the Christmas season. So for my first card, I'm going to be actually using two of the panels that we created, both of the ones that we stamped with black. And I kind of played around with how I wanted the placement, and I'm going to end up getting two cards out of this. So from the red panel, I'm going to go ahead and align a stitched rectangle die as well as a stitched circle die. And in my mind, I had something completely different, so the circle is completely optional. I'm just going to glue it back in anyway. I'm going to run that through my Gemini, and then I'm just going to piece everything together. Now, that frame piece that we have left over, I'm going to put that aside because I'm going to use that for another card. So because I pretty much positioned my card panel as well as the stamp the same each and every time, this is going to line up perfectly. So I'm going to bring back out my Tombow Mono multi glue. I do suggest using a wet glue for something like this because it does give you a couple of seconds to move things around if you need to, but I'm just going to line it up directly over the same lines that are on that first panel, if that makes sense. So it's going to be kind of a seamless pattern. It's just going to be from one panel to the next. Just going to fit that circle back in there because what I had planned was not going to work or was not going to look great. And then I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment onto another piece of Neenah Solar White Nope, it's not Neenah Solar White, it's Neenah Desert Storm. And I'm gonna be using my tonic trimmer just to cut that down into a strip that will go across my card panel there. I am gonna pop this up with some foam tape. You can certainly heat emboss this. You can make this, you know, as interesting as you want it to be. But if you're anything like me, once I get to crunch time about 2 weeks before Christmas, I realize I don't have enough cards and I may need to mass produce a bunch of them. And so this background stamp is a perfect way to make each card different and fairly simple and quick. So that's the first card. Moving on to the second card, I'm going to bring back in this little frame that we have left over here. And I kind of played around if I wanted to use another one of the panels that we created, but ultimately I figured it would probably be best just to bring in a piece of black cardstock. So I have a piece of black cardstock here. This is cut down to 5.5 by 4.25, same as my frame. And I'm going to be using another one of the, or actually two of the sentiments from that Caroling Squad stamp set. And I am going to heat emboss this right in the center of my black panel here. So I treated this with my anti-static tool, stamped this out with some Versamark ink, sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and heat set that. Once that was done and my embossing powder had a couple of seconds to cool down, you want to make sure that you do give it a couple of seconds because you can smear it while it is still hot. I'm going to go ahead and adhere my frame down. And I ended up using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue just because, like I said, it does give me a couple of seconds to move things around. But you can certainly pop this up with foam tape if you have a lot more confidence than I do. So that is a very quick second card with the same panels, actually. Moving on to the next one, we're going to bring out the one that we stamped out with Later Gator, and it looked a little bit too plain. It didn't look very Christmassy to me. So I'm going to add a little bit of red, and I'm going to bring out my T-square ruler, but you can use any flat edge here. And I'm not doing any measuring, but I'm taking a red gel pen and I'm just adding a few more lines. And I'm just eyeballing this. I'm not doing any measuring here. As far as I'm concerned, if they look even to me and look symmetrical to me, it's probably going to look the same way to the recipient of the card. And more than likely, they're not going to actually take out a ruler and measure anyway. So I'm just eyeballing this, making sure that my gel pen has time to dry before placing my ruler back onto it, or else you may smear it. So once that's done, we're going to keep this one real nice and simple. I am going to go ahead and die cut this panel with another stitched rectangle die. This one is a little bit bigger than the one that we used in the first card. And then I'm taking a piece of that same red cardstock that will match the gel pen in the background, and it will kind of bring it out a little bit. And I just cut that just a teeny tiny bit bigger than my stitched rectangle panel, and then adhered that down to a white A2 size top folding note card. And then for my sentiment, I didn't really want to cover up the background. I wanted the background to be pretty much the card. So I ended up bringing out my mini Misty just to make sure that I got a really crisp image, because I had a feeling I was going to have to stamp this twice. I'm placing my sentiment in the lower right hand corner, and I did stamp this twice with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. So for our next cards, we are going to be using one panel for two cards, and we're going to pretty much create them pretty much the same way. So I'm taking the Desert Storm cardstock here with the Bee Sting ink, and I'm going to cut it from corner to corner. So I'm just lining up each of the corners on my trimmer here and cutting that flat down. Now this is going to be two separate cards, and you can either glue this on the top or the bottom corner, whatever you prefer. I did one of each. So I'm bringing out two different card bases here, and this is both the Neenah Desert Storm as well, so it will match the paper nicely. And I am going to glue one down flat with the Tombow Mono Multi Glue, and I'm going to pop the other one up with some Scotch foam tape. And again, I did one on the bottom corner and one on the top corner. Next, I'm going to bring out that same sentiment that we used for the previous card, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp that on both of my cards. And it just wasn't popping out. It just wasn't popping out the way I wanted it to. So what I ended up doing is I ended up taking some very skinny strips of black cardstock and fitting those right along the long edge of this pattern, I guess you could say. And I'm just kind of tucking that under, the one that's kind of popped up. I prefer to put the glue on the panel itself or on the card base itself first, and then lay that strip down and then just cut away any excess that's hanging over. But that's it. That's 2 cards with 1 panel. Once those were done, we are going to move on to our final card for today's video. And I am going to be bringing back out the white panel with the red or the bee sting ink. And I'm going to add more stripes to this as well. But this time I'm going to use a gold gel pen. Now you want to make sure that you're cleaning whatever ruler that you have. I'm just using an alcohol pad there because you can see that you do leave some residue there and you don't want to smear that on your card. But once again, I'm not doing any measuring. I'm just going to eyeball this, and I'm pretty much putting these lines in the same areas that I put the other ones in. Once that was done, you do want to give it the gel pen just a minute or so to dry before you do anything else. Gel pens tend to stay wet a little bit longer than regular ink. So before I do any cutting, I want to make sure that they are completely dry. I am going to cut this into tiles or 2 separate panels, and I've done this several times before with all different backgrounds, and I just love the look of it. It's so simple to do, but it makes a very pretty card. So I'm going to cut this down a little bit, and then I'm going to cut it into equal strips. Now my strips that I created or cut down were 3/4 of an inch, but you can choose any measurements you want. You can do 4 long strips, you can do 5 long strips, you can do squares all over the entire card, whatever you prefer, it's your card. But this just is kind of an easiest way, I guess you could say, to line these up. So I'm going to take my white card base here and kind of line these up just to kind of see how they're going to look. And I do want to pop these up with some foam tape. So I'm making sure that I keep these in order exactly the way they need to be put back so it's a seamless pattern. I'm going to go ahead and adhere some Scotch foam tape to the back of each one of these strips, and then I'm using my grid mat, my work surface here, to make sure that at least the first one is lined up perfectly, and then the other ones will kind of fall into place. Just don't add any pressure to the actual piece that you're putting down until you're happy with the placement, because I tried to move that first one and it was too late. So if you kind of just lightly place it down next to the one that's already down there, it will give you the ability to move it around if you need to. In my case, I couldn't. It was what it was. Once it was down, it was down. So once all of my little panels were down there, we are going to move on to the sentiment, and I kept this nice and simple. I'm going to bring out another piece of that red cardstock that we have been working with, and I am going to go ahead and heat emboss the sentiment same way as I do always. I treated it with my anti-static tool, stamped it with Versamark white embossing powder, heat set it. The only problem is that I didn't really ink up my stamp all that great. So the embossing powder wasn't sticking the way I wanted it to, and especially when I heat set it, I don't know whether you guys can see it on camera, but it wasn't so great. So in order to fix those areas where I didn't really get a very crisp embossing area, I'm not sure the exact term of that, I'm just going to take my white gel pen and kind of fix up those little grooves that we get sometimes in between those solid images, and nobody will ever know the difference. I went ahead and trimmed that down, and then I'm going to place this across my entire card. I'm going to add a little bit of foam tape to either side, and then I'm just going to use my Tombow Mono multi glue where it's going to lay across the part that's already popped up, so it kind of lays flat across the entire card. Just going to go ahead and take my scissors to snip off any remaining that's hanging off, and that is it for the final card. Very, very simple cards today. Here is a quick look at all of the cards that we created with the backgrounds from the classic flannel background stamp. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day.